Welcome back to our study of Philippians. This is session 2, and we're going to be covering the rest of chapter 1. Chapter 1, verses 12 up through verse 30, heading into chapter 2. And if we're going to understand this letter that Paul wrote to the Philippians long ago, it's going to benefit us to have some grasp of the historical context, of the background, of the situation that Paul was in when he wrote, and of the situations that the Philippians were in when Paul wrote to them. Neither were in particularly desirable circumstances. Paul, our best guess, is writing in about the year AD 61. He's in Rome, which sounds cool, but he's actually under house arrest, which isn't very cool. You could read about his situation and the story of him getting there in Acts chapter 28. He had been told by Jesus a few years previously, "You're going to make it to Rome to testify about me," but at the time I don't know that he thought he would come in this particular type of situation. He'd been dreaming for a long time of arriving. Anyway, finally he gets there, and he can't really go anywhere because he's waiting for an audience with the emperor. And so, no question, he will preach the gospel to whomever will come his way. Probably the Roman soldiers got a little bit tired of him hearing him talk about Jesus. But at the same time, he's got some time on his hands. And so, in between meetings with various people who would come, he wrote some letters. We call them the prison letters, or the prison epistles. He wrote Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, and he wrote Philippians. Now, the Philippians were pretty far away from Rome at the time, although not really so much culturally, which we'll talk about. And the Christians in Philippi, the people to whom this letter is addressed, are just believers in Jesus trying to live faithfully in a land where it's not exactly favorable to what it is they're trying to do. They're very much in the numerical minority. They would seem very odd to a lot of the friends and family around them. They even would have been viewed pretty suspiciously, with maybe even a bit of hostility by some of the people who used to be their friends. So why don't you go to the parties that you used to go to? Why don't you worship the gods that you used to worship? What's going on with you? I feel like everything is changing. Anyway, a couple of things I want to mention about the city of Philippi that may be beneficial to know. Number one is it was a strategic location. You know, the first rule of real estate is location, 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 and that's always been to some degree true. And Philippi was for one thing, it was at the bottom of this mountain that gave quite a few valuable minerals and silver and gold and various things. So there was a bit of a prosperous economy as a result of this. It was also located along the Via Egnatia, the Egnatian Way. Maybe you've heard of this road. It was the primary east to west road in this part of the Roman Empire, which meant that you would have a lot of travelers, which meant that sometimes impressive people would come by. And it would be like having a large airport in our day. And so Paul was writing to this city that was at a strategic location, and it was also a city that had a real deep sense of patriotic passion, a patriotic spirit. It wasn't too far from here that a famous battle was won in the year 31 BC, when Octavius, who would become known as Augustus, the first real official emperor of Rome, defeated Mark Antony and took control of the empire after about a decade of civil war. And so he had all these soldiers that he had promised land to after the war, and he actually wanted to show some grace to the soldiers on the other side so that they would believe in him and that they would be committed to his reign. And so what he did was he took a lot of these Roman soldiers and he gave them plots of land in nearby Philippi. He made it a Roman colony, he gave it his official stamp of patronage, and it became one of the most patriotic cities in the empire. It was known by many as a sort of miniature Rome. They actually, as they rebuilt the city, they patterned the structure of their streets on Rome. They had Roman architecture. They would make coins that had Latin inscriptions. They actually made Latin the language of Rome instead of Greek. They made Latin the official language of some of their different celebrations and whatnot. Their clothing would be Roman. I mean, in every way, this was a place that was pro-Rome. We are flying the colors. We are raising the flag. That's the situation to which Paul writes and tells them, you're actually a kingdom, a colony of heaven, designed to be called out from the world to follow Jesus. Now, we don't know that there was any sort of persecution going on. The historical record doesn't suggest this, and the letter doesn't suggest this. But you don't have to dig beneath the letter too far to see that there's some pressures on these people. There's some hardship, not so much in the form of actual outright persecution, but there's a sense in which they're being seduced by the culture to conform back to the values of the society they were a part of before they encountered Jesus. So that's our situation. Now, Paul may be very, very happy in Philippians. We talked about how he talks about joy and rejoicing all throughout this letter multiple times. He may be very happy, but he's not happy because he's got his head stuck in the ground. He's not happy because he's ignoring the ugly realities of his situation or theirs. Matter of fact, he acknowledges these realities clear as can be. Let's go ahead and read our text for today, the letter to the Ephesians. I'm going to read again in chapter 1, starting in verse 12. I'm going to go ahead and read all the way to verse 30. Here's what he writes. He says, "Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. It is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached, and because of this I rejoice. Yes, and I will continue to rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and God's provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, what has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance. I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage, so that now, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, to live is Christ and to die is gain. And if I am to go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. Yet what shall I choose? I don't know. I am torn between the two, and I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far. But it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain, and I will continue with all of you for your progress and joy in the faith, so that through my being with you again, your boasting in Christ Jesus will abound on account of me." And then he turns his attention to their situation and says, "Whatever happens, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. And then, whether I come and see you or only hear about you in my absence, I will know that you stand firm in one spirit, striving together as one for the faith of the gospel, without being frightened in any way by those who oppose you. This is a sign to them that they will be destroyed, but that you will be saved, and that by God. For it has been granted to you on behalf of Christ not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for him, since you are going through the same struggle you saw I had, and now hear that I still have." I think in a nutshell, what we see in this passage is that the gospel changes our perspective on hardship, on suffering, on difficult times. And we already saw in the first session that Paul seems to be indicating from the start that the gospel changes people, turns us into something that we weren't before. And here we have that general truth applied to the concrete situation of Paul's being in prison and their being under pressure. Now, the gospel doesn't do away with our hardships. That's not a joking matter. This is the lie of the health and wealth gospel. That if you come to Jesus, God will eliminate all of your troubles. If you just believe hard enough, then God will take away all of your problems and give you your best life now. Now try evaluating that idea in light of the ministry of Jesus, or of the ministry of Paul for that matter. And his current troubles aren't odd or abnormal. In 2 Corinthians 11, you should read it later. In 2 Corinthians 11, he goes through and catalogs some of the sufferings that he's experienced: beatings, shipwrecks, hardship, rejection, persecution. I mean, he just catalogs these things, and that was written a few years before this one was written. And yet after all that, and in this current situation, he seems pretty fine. As a matter of fact, he seems somewhat happy. Why? How do you make sense of that? Well, I think for Paul it's simple. If the gospel's doing well, then Paul's doing well. That's what he seems to be indicating here. If the gospel is advancing, then Paul is dancing. When he first came to Philippi, they were put in prison, and he's there after being beaten in a jail cell in the middle of the night, and he turns over to his friend Silas, and I just sometimes wonder this conversation. Hey, Silas, you awake, man? Yeah, I'm awake. I'm in chains and I'm in pain. And Paul's like, hey, you want to sing? Now, Paul's not literally singing anymore, but he almost is, because you see that if the gospel is okay, then he's okay. Because Paul's central concern is not his own comfort, but whether or not the gospel is clearly being communicated. You almost get the sense that, this is the lens through which he views everything. Do you want to be enslaved, Paul, or do you want to be free? Well, are these people preaching with false motives, or are they preaching with pure motives? I mean, it seems kind of false to me, but hey, if the content of the gospel is being communicated, whatever. Well, Paul, do you want to stay alive or do you want to die? It depends. And how Paul answers the question depends. I sometimes wonder this. If you were to ask the question, hey, Paul, how's it going? I think he'd say, well, it depends. Well, it depends on what? Well, how's the gospel? The gospel's doing fine. Well, then I'm doing fine. I don't know that anything going on around him could ultimately pull him away from those answers to that question. The gospel matters centrally for Paul. Why? Because the gospel brings Jesus. That's what he says here. I want Jesus because I believe that when you have Jesus, you have everything that you need, no matter what else is going on the surface. The gospel is central for Paul because the gospel brings Jesus, and Jesus is so satisfying for Paul because Jesus brings joy, a joy that is deeper than your circumstances, a happiness that goes beneath and is much more stable than what is happening around you. Paul even looks at death and he sees Jesus and says, bring it on. Paul looks at life and he sees an opportunity to see Jesus, to serve with Jesus, and he says, okay, let's get to work. And this is actually the surprising thing of this portion of the letter. I don't find it all that surprising that Paul is fine with his situation. And I don't find it all that surprising that he calls them to be fine with their situation, because Paul believes that the gospel matters most. And I don't find it all that strange, all that odd that Paul thinks the gospel is so valuable, because the gospel brings Jesus. And I don't find it all that weird that Paul thinks that Jesus is valuable, because Jesus brings joy. But what comes next for me is actually a little bit surprising. You know, we love that phrase, to live is Christ and to die is gain, because it demonstrates for us Paul's passion. One eye always focused on Jesus, singularly focused on coming to know Jesus more, see him face to face. I want to be with him, which is better. But what comes next is what astounds me. He says, I would rather go and be with Jesus. I could just let it go and be fine. But you know why I won't? Because as much as I want to see Jesus face to face and experience that joy, I actually don't need that to have it. I experience that joy when I serve you in his name. Because the joy that Paul is seeking in Jesus is actually something that he finds when he lets Jesus turn his attention from what would be best for him to what is best for them. That's what surprises me about this text. Paul has a different perspective on his hardships because Jesus has changed the way he sees things. And then in those last few verses, Paul invites the Philippians to similarly size up their suffering. Again, we don't know exactly what was getting onto them. We don't know who these opponents are. We don't know if these were legalists. We don't know if these were hyper-patriots. We don't know if these were government officials. We don't know if these were old friends and family who were just trying to get them to come back to some of the same old ways. We really don't know what it is that was ailing them, but we do know what Paul says about it. And he says the gospel's not going to do away with your problems, folks. Matter of fact, you should probably thank God for them. What? How does that make any sense, Paul? You know what I think about when I read this passage of Scripture? It's like when you're watching sports on TV. It's a bit different than being in the game. You ever been watching sports on TV and you can see maybe you're watching football and you can see a passing angle and you're like, how did that quarterback not see that wide open receiver? Like he gets paid millions of dollars just to throw the ball to a receiver. I've heard somebody say something like that. Well, yeah, it's not like that when you're in the middle of the game. Like when you're watching it on TV, you have a vantage point that changes the situation. You can see the bigger picture. And so sure, things seem clearer to you because you're not in the middle of it. Paul seems to be saying in this passage that the gospel operates similarly with respect to our hardships. It gives us a wider vantage point to make sense of the actual pain that we're feeling in the here and now. And so when I see this passage, I pray for myself and for you that God may transform our view of all things because we have a clear vision of what the gospel brings.